Finally, I would like to move to a last point, which is also quite important, and which will link very well with the next subject, which is the subject of equity or solidarity. We'll do it here, however, rapidly because it falls under the subject of what people call representational fairness. Now, what is representational fairness? Representational fairness is the idea that opportunities should be presented in ways that are accessible for everybody. So when we're talking about a job like chief executive officer, we could talk about distributive fairness, and that would be, well, how many whites and blacks, or men and women, or young and old are CEOs? That would be the distribution of who has the job. But there's also this idea of representational fairness in artificial intelligence. That is, how does AI represent or show what this job is? And this became a subject of attention in, I believe it was 2018, when someone typed into Google the words, just the letters CEO, asked for images, and got back the screen you see here beneath the words is the screen that was received. And you notice one thing immediately, there are a lot of white men here. In fact, it's almost exclusively white men. There is, if you look carefully, one female here, one woman. Anybody notice anything about that one female? That one female is in the lower right-hand corner, and it is a doll. It is not even a real woman. It's Barbie, a Barbie doll, right? So people noticed, well, wait a minute now. This tool is really skewed in terms of how it represents CEOs against women and minorities. And that's just obvious. You can't deny it. It's there. Now, is this something that Google did intentionally? No, of course not. If you look at the CEOs for the Fortune 500, the 500 biggest companies, yes, what you're going to find more or less is a lot of white males. So the tool just left to operate and scan the internet. When it looked across the internet for CEOs, it shouldn't be at all surprising that this is what it found. Um, However, people made the case, well, look, that might be what it found. So no one is denying that. And that might be fair in some computational sense, because these faces represent, the, for the most part, these CEOs of the largest companies. But it's not fair representationally. That is, it gives the impression to users that this is a task which is only available to white men. And that's unfair. So the unfairness is how the task CEO is represented. Um, and if that's true, um, should something be done about it? It certainly seems clear that for a young person, like say a 6-year old, right, who's interested, well, what is the CEO? It seems beyond our argument that if this is the kind of image set that appears, I mean, it certainly seems that the message is being sent to anyone who is not a white male that this is not a job for you. Um, so the question about fairness is a representational question, not a distributive question. That is, it's about the impression that receivers have, not how is the world in real life. And if you want to subscribe to the notion of representational fairness, that is, that fairness should operate on the level of how things appear to be, then you need to do something. And here we can see what Google has done. This is the same search for CEO put into the Google search now. And as you can see, if anything, if anything, they have gone to the other extreme. They've perhaps overrepresented for minorities, right? Minorities are represented as CEOs in a manner which is greater than their proportion in the population. But you might make the argument that in representational terms, that's fair because it gives everyone, white males, white women, black women, etc., it gives everyone the opportunity to see that they could be a CEO. So this is Google's solution. They just make sure they jam into their images for these kinds of things a diverse set of people. in terms of race and gender. There is a question here about that diversity. Um, it's clear, just looking at the picture, you can see that Google is concerned about race, and it's clear they're concerned about gender. But what about other types of diversity? Should there be young and old CEOs? I mean, it seems like these CEOs are skewed toward older people. But think of the Altman CEO at OpenAI. I mean, he's a very young guy, right? I mean, maybe you could say, look, young people should write a letter to Google and say, we agree with your distributive, or excuse me, representational fairness CEO search, but please add some younger people too. So Google could add some younger people. Uh, and then you can imagine things with different hair colors and so on, different religions, right? Maybe people could with an Islamic faith could be shown in the CEO search because they're wearing Arabic garb. Perhaps that should be added too. The fairness question is, where does it end? Gender, race, religion, age. At some point, there's not going to be enough room on your computer screen to have one representative of every one of these various groups. So this is a practical problem with representational fairness. On the one side, certainly a strong case could be made for the idea of representational fairness, for the idea of showing that anyone who accesses the CEO search on Google should see themselves there. But the question is, how do you put that into practice? It's an area of very intense research for AI engineers today. And then the theoretical side, of course, of that challenge again is where do you draw the lines? We just, as a practical matter, we cannot include a picture of everyone. So who gets in and who does not get in and why? It's a very difficult question for representational fairness. We should just make a quick footnote. As I said here, you can see that perhaps Google overcompensated a bit with their CEO search. They use the same logic for their Gemini image generating tool, and the result was just a complete disaster. Because Google was so determined to honor representational fairness, to make sure that someone from different races and genders and so on was represented for everything. They ended up coming up with some of the most religious images possible. For example, when people asked for images of a Viking, well, a Viking we know is from northern Europe. It should be a light-skinned person, probably with a sword and helmet and shield and that kind of things. That's a Viking. They ended up putting African faces on the Viking, or images of the Pope, again, an Indian or black. Well, that's not the way the Pope usually looks. Or the founding fathers, an American founding father who was represented by Google as a person of Asian descent. Well, there were no people of Asian descent who were among the American founding fathers. So this is an example of how representational fairness can get out of control, right? Google decided that representational fairness was more important than even basic truth. Right? He said, look, we're willing to mislead or, in a sense, directly lie to our users about history in order to be representationally fair. Now, you can make the case for that. I mean, you could make, and Google did, they made the ethical case. They said, look, I would prefer to lie to my users, to be dishonest, to not tell them the truth. That's better than not being fair. Google simply said that fairness and representational fairness is the highest value. So with that choice, with the decision between treating their users unfairly and lying to their users, telling them things that were not true, Google decided to tell them things that were not true. They said, ethically, fairness is more important than honesty. I would rather be fair to someone, even if that means being dishonest, lying to them. That's an ethical stance. And Google defended that at the time. I believe they have backed off that a little bit now, but at the time, that's what Google said. Fair, because I want to be fair, I will lie to my users. You could obviously make the other claim. You could say, look, I'm willing to be unfair if that's required in order to be truthful, to tell my users the truth. And that would be kind of a dignity argument, right? Um, Treating people as dignified creatures, as dignified things means not lying to them. So in this case, there's a kind of a dignity versus fairness distinction. The dignity argument would be I do not lie to my users. And so when people ask for the founding fathers, the American of the United States, I'm going to show all white males. Now, is that unfair? In a certain sense, it is, because it sort of representationally makes the case that the only people who can be founding fathers are white males. See, then you could go to the other side. You can say, look, I am not going to accept that kind of unfairness. So I'm going to put fairness above dignity, and I'm going to put, say, Asians as founding fathers. And does that mean I subtract from my users' dignity by lying to them? Yes, it does. So you can make that case. Fairness is more important than dignity, so you lie to your users. Dignity is more important than fairness, so you tell your users the truth, but you get this problem with representational fairness. So it's a very fundamental question. Which is worth more? Telling your users the truth or treating them fairly? In this case of Google, they went for fairness instead of truth, but you could go the other way too. Finally, a last point. The same problem occurs in language. If you're doing translation, the word nurse in English, that could be a male or a female. But of course, if you're translating into the Romance languages, let's say Spanish or Italian, just as examples, then in that case, you need to choose. Is the nurse a male or a female? Now, it's true that most nurses in most hospitals in Italy, let's say, are in fact female. So is that a reason for translating nurse into female every time? Or should it be translated with respect to the proportions? I mean, there are some male nurses. Should those proportions be calculated and nurse be translated in those proportions? Or it's true that both men and women can be nurses. So should the AI translation 50% of the time translate nurse as a female and 50% of the time translate nurse as male? A case can be made for all of those possibilities. If you are an advocate for representational fairness, you might lean toward the 50-50 solution. Because again, what's important there is showing both men and women equally that they can aspire to this job. Okay, so that covers what we want to say about fairness. What have we done? First, we've talked about the experience of fairness, what fairness feels like. And fairness feels like that dilemma you have with the AI image analysis, and you see it works better for people with one skin color than another, which for most people is disturbing. It feels unfair. But then you also see it works better for people who are more vulnerable and not as well for people who are less vulnerable. It treats unequals unequally. And in that sense, it seems like it might be fair. It's not clear. Then we move from that experience to the definition of fairness, and that's Aristotle. Fairness treated equals treated equally, and unequals treated unequally within the decision domain. And then we moved on to the case of hiring, and we talked about the bookshelf in the background, and we said, look, there in the case of hiring, there are difficult questions about how we can treat unequals unequally fairly, because hiring means choosing one person for the job and rejecting everyone else. So we're treating people unequally. But how, in what sense should we consider them unequally? Should we consider their background or not? Then we did something similar when we talked about the Compass and ProPublica case and the algorithm for predicting criminal behavior. Then we talked very briefly and said that fairness and privacy are a dilemma that you can't resolve. You have to choose. Do you want to be fair, or do you want to be or enforce privacy? There's no way to get both. And then we said that we talked about the case of representational fairness, and we talked about this difference between how, let's say, jobs are distributed and how they are portrayed. And we asked, how important is it that everyone who Googles the word CEO sees someone who looks like them on that page. To the degree that is important, and that is a question of fairness, that is a question of representational fairness. Good. So that is enough on fairness.